All right, so a couple things before we jump back into material here. We'll have today's participation quiz. I'll have that Module 7 quiz to be released after we are done with class today. So that quiz and the Module 5-6 quiz are due at the end of the day Sunday, along with those participation quizzes that we've had up to this point. You also have the Module 8 reading, which is due before we start class tomorrow. So we'll begin Module 8 tomorrow, finish it on Monday. Then next Tuesday, Wednesday, we'll look at Module 9. So I'll have Module 9's reading pop up here before we start class tomorrow, so you can get that done before next Tuesday, right? And then after Wednesday's class, Thursday, we'll have review next week for that exam. Here's that practice exam and problems. And then next Friday will be the second midterm. Once again, that participation quiz kind of from Monday. Make sure you can use that lockdown browser, so we shouldn't have a problem with that. Please, if you haven't already done it, get that done as early as possible so we can kind of iron out any issues that might exist before next Friday. Other than that, I don't think there's any other housekeeping things. So any questions for me before we jump into material here? Okay, so we left off thinking about classifying these different types of goods. So we had 4 different categories. I'll kind of run through an example today where we look at one good and see how the characteristics, when they change, it can change the type of good. So we said the characteristics that define goods are they rival or non-rival? So if it's rival, that meant when I use it, no one else can, or that when I use it, there's a lower quantity out there for other people to use. Non-rival is when I use something, it doesn't decrease the quantity that's available, or it doesn't prevent other people from using that exact same product. Excludable, non-excludable, probably the easiest way to think about that was excludable is when we had to pay a price for something. Non-excludable, that was when something was essentially free, right? Or had no cost to us using it, okay? So let's think about one specific type of good. We'll say a road here, and we'll think about what traits of that road would make it one of these 4 different types of goods. So let's say I wanted to know, or say, is a road a public good? Well, if a road was a public good, we know that it would have to be non-rival and non-excludable, right? So this is the idea that you don't have to pay a price to use it, and you using it doesn't prevent other people from using it. So if this was a toll road, this is a road you have to pay to use, that is not a non-excludable good, that's excludable, right? Anytime something has a price associated with using it, that is going to be an excludable good. So we're looking for a non-excludable good, or like Highway 46 here in Bloomington, a non-toll road, okay? I think it's 46, 45, 46, whatever it is. And then the other characteristic, is it congested or uncongested? Or think about, is there a lot of traffic? Is there a traffic jam or no traffic? Well, if there's no traffic on a road, think about like the interstate, anybody can get onto that road. Even if you're using it, it doesn't prevent other people from using that road as well. However, if it's so busy that it's backed up, like sometimes the interstate around Indianapolis will get backed up to where people can't even merge onto the highway, well, that congested road, me being on the highway, is preventing other people from getting on and using it. So when it's congested, that would be excludable, or sorry, that would be rival. When it's uncongested, that would be non-rival. So we wanted a non-rival, non-excludable good. So that's going to be a non-toll road and not congested or uncongested. So here, kind of our answer there would be D, right? Now, what if we're looking at that same good, but we said instead of a public good, is it considered a common resource? So a common resource, we said, was like a public good, free for people to use, so non-excludable. This is like a lake, and the fish in that lake, you just go fish, catch fish from it. So non-excludable, but it's going to be rival, right? Me catching a fish, no one else can catch that same fish. So if it's a road, we said what makes it non-excludable? It would have to be a non-toll road. You don't have to pay to use it. But it's rival. That means when I'm using it, it prevents other people from using it. That would be that congested or kind of backed up highway. So same good, slightly different characteristic can change the type of good that it is. Okay. So a congested non-toll road would be an example of a common resource. If we want just our typical private good, this is most goods we think about, we said those were going to be rival and excludable. So we just said rival means it would have to be busy or congested. What would make it, sorry, yeah, so that's what would make it rival, but what would make it excludable? Well, we have to pay a price to use it. That would be our toll road. So a congested toll road would be an example of a private good. And then which would make it a natural monopoly? So that was where it's excludable. You have to pay to use it, but it's non-rival. So paying to use it, that makes it a toll road. We need it to be a toll road, but me using it doesn't prevent other people from using it. That would be an uncongested toll road. Okay. So this was an example where if we start to change the characteristics, it can change the type of good that it is. Okay. If we have time at the end, I've got a problem. I might work through another example of a good where if its characteristics change, it would change the classification that we would kind of put that good under. Okay. So that's kind of finishing the discussion of where we left off last class. We're going to take what we talked about last class with positive and negative externalities, and then look more closely at public goods, common resources, and compare those to private goods. So with a public good, right, I'll kind of give a nice little setup to show why we typically don't see the market get to a socially efficient quantity. So I put law example. I don't know. I was thinking about like if I could hire a police officer and let's say it was $35 an hour, or sorry, $35 for a police officer. You know, I mean, obviously this is like, I don't know, an hourly rate, or you could think about this as like in thousands or however we want to break this down, just to kind of have some simple numbers to it. The price, let's say, of hiring that officer is 35. Right? If we had an individual in our economy, Tom, and we would say, okay, look, Tom is willing to pay for how many of these officers, right? Well, the very first one, his marginal benefit of that having that police officer, you know, patrol the community would be $50. And so is that marginal benefit greater than the price to Tom? Yes, he'd hire an officer for his community. What about the second one? Well, 40, his marginal benefit is still greater than that marginal cost or the price of 35. So yes, he'll hire the second. What about the third? Well, there the marginal benefit is below the cost, so no. So he'd stop at 2, but the socially efficient quantity isn't going to be 2 if Tom isn't the only person in this society, right? So let's think about if we have 2 people in this society, both Tom and Jill. We already determined Tom, if we allow the market to operate freely, he'll hire 2 officers. But if this is a public good, as soon as that first officer is hired, Jill enjoys the marginal benefit. She doesn't have to pay for it. If Tom pays for that officer, she also gets to enjoy the marginal benefit because it's non-excludable. Okay. Now, even if we had Jill making the decision on her own, how many officers would she hire? Well, for the very first officer, her marginal benefit of 30 is below the cost of 35. She won't hire any. So she won't be a consumer in this market. But if Tom is consuming this good or hiring 2 officers, she still gets to enjoy the marginal benefit. Right? So what is the total benefit to society? Here it's a simple 2-person society, so we would add up their marginal benefits at every quantity. So the marginal social benefit of the first officer is 80, second officer 65, third officer 50, so on and so forth. So if we were allowing individuals to make decisions, we'd only end up with 2 officers. If we could make this decision for the entire society, should we hire the first officer? Well, 80 is greater than 35, so yes. Second officer, 65 is greater than 35, so yes. Third, 50 is greater than 35, so yes. Fourth, it's exactly equal. So just like with all of our other good markets, we say they would kind of go up to the point where the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost to society. So they would hire the fourth. Would they hire the fifth? 20 is less than 35, so no. So for society, the optimal quantity would be 4. Right? So this is a very basic 2-person, right, society example where we can see that for public goods, if they're non-excludable, we end up with, and that's one of the traits of a public good, the socially efficient quantity will always be greater than the quantity that the market arrives at if we allow individuals just to make the decisions on their own. Okay. So what does this kind of look similar to? this should look similar, something we talked about last class. So if I've got, well, this is my price here, my supply curve, my demand curve, demand reflects marginal benefits, supply reflects marginal costs. Here's kind of my equilibrium price and quantity. So when did the market produce too little compared to where society wanted it? Well, that would have to be when there was additional benefits to society that the people in the market weren't taking into consideration. Excuse me. So whenever we had additional benefits or external benefits, this was like looked like we're modeling it through the demand curve. This was a positive externality. So public goods, we typically see once they're out there, they're non-excludable. As soon as someone pays for that very first unit, everyone can enjoy the benefit of that first unit being out there. So we have a positive externality, which results in the market actually stopping at a quantity that's too low. Okay. And then we can also think about what would the socially efficient, we didn't really talk about this too much last class, we focused more on quantity, but what would the socially efficient price be? Well, there it would actually be at a slightly higher price. Right? So we can kind of compare both of these points, both the quantity and the price that society would want to reach that optimal level. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving here? Okay. And just to kind of remind us, the fact that they stopped here meant that for all of these units, we were missing out on this surplus or it was creating some deadweight loss. Okay. So, the different kinds of goods that we'll be talking about today, public goods and common resources, are going to exhibit essentially externalities. So we already said with public goods, we have positive externalities that exist. And so as a result, there's non-excludable, right? And they're also, there's no price associated with it. We would see the efficient quantity for society is actually higher than what the market stops at for public goods. And then we'll talk about common resources here in a little bit. So if we allow individuals to make the decision about production, consumers and producers, they'll arrive at the inefficient outcome. What can we do to resolve this? Well, we said, how do we resolve positive externalities, right? So how do I push the market up to a higher quantity? Well, we said there I could give, and here's where, draw a different graph. Well, I'll do it on here for a second. So we want to shift that demand curve so that it perfectly matches up with the marginal social benefit. How can I do that? I can give consumers a subsidy, right? So this is kind of typically how I showed you last class, and we're thinking about why subsidies resolve this positive externality issue. It's because it would increase the demand curve until it's matching up with society's demand curve or the marginal social benefit. Okay. Now, what's actually interesting, and I'll just want to draw it out again just so we have fewer things going on in this graph. Just to make this point, it doesn't matter who we give that subsidy to. So if this was our positive externality and we gave a subsidy so that at every point demand is what it was before plus the subsidy, we get it, our new equilibrium point would now be out here, right? So this is the quantity for society and the quantity after the subsidy. If we instead gave this subsidy to producers, well, that's not going to shift demand. What is that going to shift? Supply. If I give companies money for making something, essentially their marginal cost is whatever it was before minus the subsidy. So notice if it's the same amount or the same size subsidy, it would increase demand or decrease supply. So this is like the supply curve minus a subsidy, because if supply represents costs, when I give companies money, their costs are going down. I actually end up with, if I give a subsidy to producers or consumers, I still would end up at that same quantity. So it doesn't matter who we give the subsidy to, as long as we've accurately determined what the size of the positive externality is, we can push this market to that socially efficient quantity. Okay. Okay. All right. So what's some other issues that exist with these public goods? So another way of thinking why we end up with a quantity that is too low is basically this free rider problem. Okay. So the free rider problem originates from the fact that once a public good is out there, if it's truly non-excludable, everyone can enjoy the marginal benefit of it. Okay. So I think I've got an example later on where we're thinking about this in terms of like research and development. So let's say we have a society where there's no patents, right? And that once I come up with some new product, anyone can mimic it and sell it, right? So let's think about if I come up with this new product, right? And everybody else can use it. Well, I'll start out with a scenario. Let's assume that, right, I would gain an additional $10,000. Okay. However, if it cost me $50,000 to dump into this research and development, right, what is that cost to me going to be? Well, I actually lose 40,000. So am I going to put any money into research and development? No, right? However, we know that for an economy, we want companies to be coming up with new products. I'll give you a better example. Let's assume instead of 10,000 here, it was 100,000, right? Well, now we might think, okay, this is actually, right, here's the benefit, here's the cost to research and development. There would actually be like a profit to the firm. Okay. Well, the problem is, even in this scenario, we still see that some firms wouldn't put any money into research and development. Why? Well, if I don't put money into research and development and another company does, right? In this scenario, if I can just steal their or reverse engineer their product, I can still make an additional $100,000. But if I steal that research and development's byproduct from someone else, what are my costs now? Zero. So where am I better off if I don't put any money into research and development and just hope, rely on other people to come up with these new products? I can back engineer them, make the same amount of money, but incur no costs. So I'd actually be better off there. So there's this incentive to always be the company that doesn't put money into research and development. So that's what we would call free riding, right? That once another company comes up with this new technology, if I can just back engineer it, then there's no sense for me to put money into research and development. I'll just wait until someone else does. The only problem is if that incentive exists for every single company, nobody puts any money into research and development. What is the additional gain now? Well, this additional $100,000 is only coming from the fact that we came up with a new product. So if everybody relies on someone else to do it, we end up with zero, in which case we are actually worse off. So this free rider problem with public goods will lead us to the point where we sometimes would see none of this public good actually being supplied or actually being produced in the market. Okay. That's kind of like the most extreme example. Okay. Oh, scrolled too fast. There we go. So some other examples, national defense. I used this one last class as an example. I use police officers today, but firefighters, really anything that you can think of that is, paid for by the government, that any one person isn't going to fund their own fire department, right? Those would be kind of some important public goods where we know if individuals have to make the decision on their own, no one's going to hire pay for their own fire department, right? But we know that collectively, as society is much better off if we have all of society is better off is if we have a fire department. And then knowledge. This is kind of my research and development example. We want to make sure that there's, knowledge gains through scientific research. If there's no money being provided to public institutions, right, like IU or other colleges, and no one is doing any scientific research, what ends up happening to the amount of research we get? Well, we said public goods, if I can get there we go. Public goods kind of have these positive externalities. So we end up with a lot less of that. So a lot less scientific research. So what do? We fund public universities so that people are paid, right, to kind of be in these roles, doing research on different areas. Okay. All right. So just a couple more examples there. To hopefully, one of these connects with you, thinking about public goods. So I try to just give a bunch of as many examples as I can. Right. Excuse me. Another thing that's worth talking about a little bit with public goods, is okay. We know that we want more of them, but they have to be paid for by someone. Typically, that's the government. So where do they get the money to pay for the fire department or to pay give money to these public institutions of higher learning? Well, they generally have to tax other goods and then use that tax money, right? So really what ends up happening is the government has to do some cost benefit analysis. Okay. So first of all, it's very difficult to measure the true benefit of a lot of public goods. Like what's the true marginal benefit of, scientific research or a fire department or the national defense? It's very difficult. Right? But ultimately what the government tries to do is they have people working on this where they try to come up with ways to measure what that benefit is. And then hopefully, if they're making decisions that are optimal for society, that benefit will be greater than the cost that comes from taxing things. So what is the cost of taxes, right? Well, we can think about anytime we taxed products, we said what existed. So if I start to tax things like alcohol, cigarettes, we said we're going to generate some dead weight loss in those markets. So I don't know, maybe I tax all these goods, I get some dead weight loss that exists from those goods. So maybe it's something like, I don't know, we lose $1 billion of surplus from alcohol and tobacco products. But in the process, and when we computed a lot of these values, what we typically saw was the dead weight loss was generally quite a bit less than tax revenue. So if I could generate, say, $50 billion in tax revenue, but the dead weight loss was only 100, right? And that $50 billion, I've determined that that's kind of the marginal social benefit of, I don't know, national defense. And these numbers might, are probably not even close to what they are, but you get the idea, just to have some simple numbers to go with it. Well, if we use that tax revenue to pay for our national defense, here's the kind of additional marginal social benefit to society that came at only a dead weight loss of $1 billion. Well, it would make sense to tax those products in order to pay for this public good. Now, it's very difficult to determine what the actual marginal social benefit of national defense is. And we also are probably taxing multiple things. So we'd have to figure out the dead weight loss from multiple product markets. But at the end of the day, as long as that marginal social benefit, the gain from having that public good, is greater than the dead weight loss that comes from the taxes, it would be optimal to tax and pay for it. It's just cost benefit analysis there. Okay. All right. So I kind of already worked through this kind of with the positive externalities, and then we talked about how the subsidies can kind of resolve this issue because public goods, we see them exhibit positive externalities. I want to think about, well, before we go to common resources, I want to show you a different way of thinking about positive externalities. Now, when I ask you questions on the quiz or the exam, I'll always have you model positive externalities through the demand curve. However, I do want to be complete because if you were looking this up somewhere else, you might see that you can actually model it a different way. Okay? So I could model that I wanted the marginal social benefits. In fact, I had one over here. So let me just have this so it's side by side. Not that one. There you go. So we modeled here this positive externality through the demand curve and said that the equilibrium quantity or the optimal point for society is going to be greater than the market equilibrium. Okay? If I think about positive externalities or like additional benefits to my society, I can also think about, well, if I have an additional benefit, that's also kind of like the same thing as saying it's reducing total costs, right? Now, this isn't a perfect way of thinking about it, but if it reduced the total cost to society, you can think about it as here would be like my marginal social costs, right? So if we think about like when people are not doing something, that dead weight loss existing or these additional benefits that we're missing out on, they're kind of like opportunity costs, right? So if instead, right, I think of these as, well, what is a positive externality? It's almost like I'm removing an opportunity cost, right? So where would the market equilibrium quantity be? Down here. Where would the socially efficient quantity be? Right here. Right? So you can kind of see we get the same result if we modeled these positive externalities as instead of like additional benefits, lower costs. Lower costs really are like additional benefits. Now, when it comes to talking about things like comparing that socially efficient price to the market price, there we're always going to model our positive externalities through the demand curve. So the only types of questions I will ask you related to this socially efficient price, I'm assuming that we're modeling our positive externalities as higher marginal benefits. But I have had questions before, and just to be complete, you technically can model this as though they're lower cost to society when we have positive externalities. Okay. There, I think the research and development one kind of makes sense because like if there's this new cost-cutting technique out there, you can really think about it as the benefit to society is actually a way that producers can cut their costs. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. All right, nothing in the chat. So that's public goods. The next thing we'll kind of talk about are common resources. Okay. So with common resources, excuse me, they're also non-excludable, right? So the fact that you don't have to pay to use them once they're there, once there's a lake with fish in it, anyone can go fish it. We're still going to see there's a lot of free riders, right? There's people that are going to want to go fish that lake, but you know, they don't have to really bear the cost that if they overfish it, there aren't future fish for people to catch, right? So it'll kind of fall victim to this free rider, the fact that no one has to pay for it to use it, kind of like public goods. However, there's not going to be much of an incentive for firms to provide goods if we've got common resources. Now it's kind of the reverse, right? When we have common resources, we actually end up seeing that they get overused instead of underused like a public good. And so we still have a role for the government. So some of the additional problems that exist with common resources is that if we said what makes it a common resource versus a public good? Well, common resources were rival instead of non-rival. So when I use this common resource, it prevents other people from using that same good, or it reduces the quantity that's available. When I go out and fish in this lake, the fish I catch, there are now fewer fish out there for other consumers. Okay? So the role of the government with common resources will be to make sure these goods don't get overused. Okay? So some examples of common resources, we already kind of talked about like the congested toll road, or sorry, congested non-toll road. Really any like thing that you would fish or hunt, like deer in Indiana is a good example. Clean air and water, right? It's non-excludable. Anyone can use it. But when I start to use clean water, there's less out there for other people. So it's rival. So we've got these common resources. And I'll really kind of use this fishing example. And I'll probably also start to mention like deer just because it's, I don't know, Indiana and a lot of people hunt. I've got some other examples as well, but we'll want to understand what inefficiencies or kind of market failures exist with common resources. So unlike the free rider problem, the common resources fall victim to something we call tragedy of the commons. Okay, so with common resources, we see that typically there's negative externalities that exist when people use a common resource. When I start to fish this lake, there are fewer fish out there. The fish can't repopulate themselves. And so I'm incurring additional costs to other people in the future that might want to fish that lake. Right? They currently might not even be a consumer producer in that market, but down the road they will be. Okay. So if I have this like bluefin tuna example, every company that, their incentive is to go out, catch as many fish as they want, as possibly can, right? They're trying to maximize their own profits. The problem is, if everyone is out there fishing on this lake, the bluefin tuna can't repopulate itself, right? And the numbers start to dwindle. Okay. Now, if there are fewer fish to catch, that's going to have an additional cost to society. There aren't as many fish out there. So we would think about there's a negative externality. Every company has the incentive to go out and use this lake, catch fish. However, if everyone has that incentive, it gets overfished. So another example is like, I'm not as familiar with this, but I think like out west, there was like common land that they would have set aside for anyone could take their cattle to graze on this land. Well, the problem is if I have this available to me and it's free, it's common land, I can just walk my cattle over to graze on this land. Well, why would I have them graze my own land when I could have them graze this common land? The problem is every farmer has that incentive. So what happens to this common land? It gets overgrazed and essentially becomes dirt, right? And it's no longer able to be used. So what is the marginal benefit to society of that common land now? Well, if it's dirt, zero, right? There's no longer any value to it. So there's always the incentive for everyone to kind of overuse these common resources, resulting in we end up with a quantity that's very low. Or sorry, not a quantity that's very low. We end up seeing they overuse it. The quantity is higher than the socially efficient quantity. The socially efficient quantity should be lower than what is currently being used. Think of another example here, kind of apply to everyone's life. So trying to think of something most of you would be familiar with, but so there is like break rooms. I don't know how many of you have worked a job. Like when I was in high school, I worked I was a stocker at a grocery store. I worked at a lumber yard, and there's always these like common places for people to eat lunch and whatever. So there's like a fridge, right? And everyone has an incentive to put their lunch in that fridge. Or maybe a better example is there's a microwave. Everyone has the incentive to be able to use that microwave. The problem is who's you know, who's cleaning that microwave? Well, there's no incentive that exists to be the one that cleans it. So if we all use it, it gets overused. It becomes so dirty that no one wants to use it, or essentially it gets overused until it becomes rival, right? So this would be like another example of a tragedy of the commons. There's this communal good. It's non-excludable. Everyone can use it. But as more and more people use this microwave, it becomes dirtier and dirtier. It's eventually going to become rival and that no one now wants to use it because it's so filthy. Kind of a goofy example, but it is a good example of this tragedy of the commons. Okay. So I've got this kind of set up with common resources here. I think I'm going a little bit out of order with the slides, but before we get to that, let's think about just common resources in general and relate it to what we talked about yesterday. So typically, we can think of if we have a common resource so that people using this microwave or using this common grazeland, every time this thing is used, it's, every time that land is grazed by cattle, there's less and less grass or whatever it is available for other people to then go graze on that land. Or as more and more people catch fish in a lake, there's fewer fish out there for the rest of the people to catch. Right? So we're going to have this negative externality. So typically we modeled those as higher costs. So we said the market will always stop at a quantity, and here would be kind of the equilibrium price. The socially efficient quantity, remember, no positive externalities now. So where does marginal social benefit equal marginal social cost? The optimal quantity for society, or the optimal kind of number of cattle to graze, or farmers to take their cattle to graze this land, is actually lower than what the market will arrive at. Okay. And then we could also be asked questions like, what's true about that socially efficient price? Well, with negative externalities, it should be higher than what the market arrives at. Okay. So what can we do to solve the common resource problem? We said we could, how do we shift supply or increase supply here? We could tax producers. That would decrease the supply curve or increase the cost at every quantity, right, by whatever the value of that tax is. So that's one way that we could kind of push the market down to this lower quantity. Similar to when I was talking about subsidies, you could actually technically also impose a tax not on the producers to shift supply. You could tax the consumers so that you would decrease demand. Well, I kind of missed my point there, but right. So this would be like demand plus this tax, right? Additional cost. I'm lowering the marginal benefit to consumers. So it doesn't matter if I tax producers or consumers. I can solve this issue that I want the quantity to be lower in this market, this negative externality. I can push the market down to that lower quantity by taxing either party. Okay. And then to really highlight what's an extreme example of these common resources before we jump into the example that I have in the slides. Let's think if I had a common resource and it was completely free, right? So if it's completely free, what would the marginal cost be? Down here at 0, right? So like that equilibrium quantity would be way out here. So if my marginal cost is 0 and there's a negative externality, I could almost think about here, the easiest way to think about it is this would be the value of that negative externality. So the quantity that society wants is actually should be lower than where the market arrives at if that cost is exactly 0. Now, even if in our examples of like going out to fish on a lake, you still have to buy a boat, you have to, you use hours. So there is going to be some cost. But even if we had something where it was completely costless, we can see that, oh yeah, the market will always arrive at a quantity that's too high. Okay. All right. So just like with our positive externalities, last class, we always modeled these negative externalities through our supply curve. Right? You can actually think about it as the reverse as well, right? So even though I was kind of modeling these through my supply curve or higher costs, I could also think about, well, what is a higher cost? It's another way of saying that. So here's our market that's in equilibrium. Well, I could also think about that as whatever the benefits to consumers were before, right? From having this lake and being able to fish, there's now an additional cost. So it's almost like the consumer's marginal benefit is now lower. So you can actually model negative externalities sorry, if I'm adding a cost, it's like I'm subtracting from the marginal benefit. Well, notice I get the same implication if I model it through the demand curve, which is that the market is arriving at a quantity that's too high. So you can model negative externalities through your demand curve. And in fact, this is what I did here, right, in this depiction. So this is looking at the number of boats like on an ocean or a lake. This is like the bluefin tuna example. So one thing that could also occur is I'm drawing all of these positive negative externalities as like parallel shifts. They don't have to be. You can think about an example here where if I'm going from 0 to 1 boat, so I'm going to, how many tons I'm catching per month. So this one boat they catch a bunch of fish, right? That's their marginal benefit. Now, the reason why there's an additional cost to society is because when they catch those fish, the supply doesn't stay as high as it could because they can't repopulate. And so there's a little bit less fish in this lake available for other people, or there's this additional cost to society. Now, when there's only one boat, that cost is relatively low. Like the fish can still kind of repopulate themselves. But as I see more and more boats on this lake, what's happening? The fish can't repopulate. There's even less fish available. So that external cost or that negative externality actually starts to get larger and larger. That gap in between our marginal benefit and the marginal social benefit gets larger and larger and larger. Okay? So we can model negative externalities kind of as a decrease in the marginal social benefit, and they don't have to be parallel shifts. They can actually be growing as the quantity of this good is going up, right? Or as the number of boats fishing on this lake goes up. Okay? So we can see here, like in this example, the market, right? The number of boats that will end up on this lake would be 8. But for society, the efficient point would actually be where marginal social benefit is equal to marginal social cost, or at a lower quantity of 4. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Just a slightly different way of thinking about negative externalities. Okay. Another way of thinking about this is if I have a common resource, and this boating example is a good one. So as more boats are on this lake fishing, initially the first boat that goes out there maybe can catch 100 fish. Right? So the average catch, there's one boat catching 100 fish, would be 100. So what's the change? Well, we went from 0 fish caught, 0 boats. So the total catch changed by 100. The total number of boats changed by 1. 100 over 1 is 100. That's our marginal number of fish caught. Now, when we go to 2 boats, the amount of fish being caught, right? The more boats there are, the less, how do I want to say this? The slower or the more ineffective the fish are at repopulating themselves. So it's not that the second boat is also going to be able to catch 100 fish. The second boat might only be able to catch an additional 80, right? So the additional 80 fish being caught, that's our marginal catch. And now there's 2 boats, 180 fish being caught. The average catch per boat would be 90. So as we add more boats to this lake, you'll notice that, yes, initially, the total number of fish caught is going up, right? Now, the average number caught per boat is going down, right? Because the more boats there are, the slower the fish can repopulate themselves. And so, that's decreasing. And so is the marginal catch as well. Now, eventually we get to a point. So at that 4th boat, that boat is still catching an additional 50 fish for society, right? So as long as society just cares about having more fish, that would be beneficial. Once we get to that 5th boat, there's now so many people fishing this lake that the fish population is decreasing so much that 5 boats actually only catch 250, right? They don't allow the population to kind of stay as high. So as we kind of add boats past 4, notice the total catch is actually going to start going down lower and lower. Okay? And then if the total catch is going down, that means our marginal catch is negative. Well, having fewer fish, is that a good or a bad thing for society, right? In terms of the number caught, that's bad. So we would actually want to stop where the last marginal catch is positive, right? Past that point, for society, adding more boats is actually going to have a negative impact. Or the market, they don't care about this though. The market makes decisions just based off their own marginal costs and benefits. So if we saw there being 8 boats, we know that the marginal social, benefit is actually going to be lower than the marginal social cost, or that we're having this kind of decrease in the overall number of fish being caught. Okay. Any questions on that idea before we keep moving? Where are we at in time? All right, we're pretty good. So how can we solve this issue? Well, with negative externalities, we can establish property rights. So we can make people pay for these goods. So we said that common resources are rival and non-excludable. Well, if I make them excludable, it's no longer a common resource that falls victim to things like the tragedy of the commons or has these negative externalities, people now have to pay to use this good. It now is rival and excludable. It now becomes a private good. Okay. I could also set quotas. So we haven't talked about this yet. I've got one depiction I want to show you with this. And we also said we can tax them. Right? So subsidize public goods, tax common resources. Excuse me. And we already went through that tax example. So I wanted to go through this quota example with you before we keep moving. All right. So I'm going to kind of show you two concepts on the same graph. So I'll go a little bit slow initially and then tell you when I'm kind of transitioning to the second concept. So here's the quantity the market arrives at. We said we model negative externalities through that supply curve. So there's no positive externalities. So the social benefit's the same as the private marginal benefits, and society wants there to be a lower quantity. So we talked last class with negative externalities, we could actually set quotas, right? So one way that this can be done is something like, deer in Indiana, you have to have, you only get so many deer tags. I forget what it is, like one buck and one doe. Some seasons they increase the number of doe, I think. It's kind of based off of whatever the population is, right? It's based off whether they think that it can repopulate at the same rate. So having to limit the number that of deer someone can hunt, you're essentially setting a quota. You're restricting quantity in that market. So that's the easiest way to think about it, is if we were just to set like a quota, right? You can't go past this point. Now, what we'll also see when it comes to things like pollution, or if it does come to something like, let's say, we wanted to auction off the rights to, purchase deer tags. Well, what could actually occur, not that this is exactly how it works with deer, but it could work with other goods, is if I only want there to be a lower quantity, what could I do? I could actually say there's only, I don't know, 1,000 deer tags this year, or only 1,000 people can hunt deer, and we're going to auction off the rights, or you can buy a deer tag, in this auction. Well, the very first deer tag purchased in an auction, how much is someone going to be willing to pay? Whoever values it the highest, so they're going to pay this much in the auction. And then the next highest person, next highest, next highest. If I create an auction system with a quota, what ends up happening? Consumers would end up paying exactly what their marginal benefit is, or at least close to it. Like in an ideal world, we had a perfect auction. So consumer surplus is essentially zero. Producer surplus, area below the price, but above this supply curve, would be this. Now, remember we said, what is total surplus to society with a negative externality? It's just the difference between the marginal social benefits and the marginal social costs. So even if we use this system, right, where we have an auction and we have these quotas, so we have all of this producer surplus, but what do we also have? Well, for every unit or every deer that's still killed, there's still a negative externality. We said the value of that is this parallelogram. So these kind of offset, and we're left with this total surplus that was maximized for society, or at that quantity where total surplus is maximized for society. So we can get the same implications by setting quotas, or even using kind of this auction system only up to a certain quota or a certain quantity. And it would have the same effect as if we taxed that product. Okay. All right. So we went through a tax example already earlier. Is there anything else? I probably already mentioned this. We talked about auctioning off permits and allowing the use of a resource. We talked about taxes. So hunting and fishing licenses, even if I don't like have a quantity set for how many deer tags you can get, if I charge people money in order to hunt or fish in a specific area, I'm essentially taxing them. That's essentially tax. Or you can think of it as like, if I have a national park, it isn't truly a public good, because if it was, I could just walk in without paying. So instead of making these national parks public goods, right, they kind of charge a price, or they make them, excludable, right? So taxing, right, the use of that national park, what's that going to do? It's going to decrease the number of people that are in those parks. So the government must believe that for a lot of these national parks, if they didn't charge a price to go into them, too many people would be there and it would be overused, and then it would kind of deteriorate the value of the national park. And so what do? They want the quantity of these national parks, or the number of people using these national parks, to go down, so they impose a price, or essentially set a tax. Right? It's not the way you would typically think about a tax, but essentially that's what it is, right? You're increasing the cost to someone who's wanting to use that. You're taxing the consumers. Okay? And then if we have a common resource like land, well, maybe the government comes in, they parcel it off and then sell it at auctions, right? They sell it off to different individuals who want that grazing land. Okay? So kind of a summary here. We've got today's quiz, and then I might have a couple questions that I want to work through. Public goods tend to be underprovided, and common resources are overconsumed. Right? So this was our directly lined up with the fact that we have positive externalities with public goods, negative externalities with common resources. Okay. We can establish property rights or make people internalize those additional costs and benefits by quotas, taxes, and subsidies. And really the only way that we can get to that socially efficient quantity is we need some type of central body or governing body like the government to come in and enforce these policies. Okay. Any questions on that before we jump over to this participation quiz for today? Okay. So if I'm looking at this quiz, right, the first one talks about a public good. We're thinking about the market quantity and how we can solve the inefficiencies that exist with a public good. So we said that with a public good, we're going to be kind of rehashing something we've already seen today, but I think it's worthwhile, because I'm going to make another point that's not in the question, but it could be asked. Right? So if I've got a market for a public good, the equilibrium quantity and price are right here. With a public good, we know that they have positive externalities, right? That once that good is out there, it's non-excludable, everyone can enjoy it. So there's some additional benefit from that good being out there. So we would think about the marginal social benefit is going to be higher. So where's the efficient point for society, right? It's actually going to be at a quantity and price that are higher than the market equilibrium. Now, the one thing that we talked about, how can we push the market to this higher quantity? We said through the use of a subsidy, and that could be on consumers or producers. Here, I'm just going to kind of write that in as it's, a subsidy to the consumers. Now, even if this wasn't, right? So let's say I have this, I'll draw on a separate one, but let's say I gave the subsidy to the consumers. Well, remember when we have subsidies and taxes, the reason why this price for society gets tricky to think about is because what is the new equilibrium price? Well, the new price that consumers pay, right, would be up here, right? But remember, that was the price they pay plus the subsidy. So this is the amount of money they're handing over. So this is like the price to producers. And then the price that the consumer actually pays, well, this is how much money they're handing over, but they were given a subsidy. So the price that the consumer actually pays would be somewhere down here. So we made this distinction more with taxes and subsidies last class. But essentially, once you have a tax or a subsidy, the price the seller receives and the price the consumer pays won't be the same. So when we're talking about that efficient price for society, it's really whatever that price will be on the market, whatever amount of money is handed over for that product. Now, the price the consumer actually pays will be however much money they hand over. So if I pay $500, but I was given $200 by the government, then the consumer really only pays $300. Okay. So this price that's optimal for society with subsidies is referencing really the price that the seller is going to receive. Okay. And yeah, we're on time. I don't want to confuse you too much. I would say if you're ever thinking about how to correct these positive externalities, think of subsidies to the consumers. The subsidy to the producer would kind of work the same way. We would just see like a decrease in supply. It would still push us out to this same quantity. Okay. So there we had what? Oh, the market quantity will be too low. And in order to get to the socially efficient quantity, we need to use a subsidy. Okay. Now, the next one is talking about a common resource. So with common resources, we know that we're going to have a negative externality. And I think the first thing I asked was just what the trait of a common resource is. So we said common resources are going to be rival and non-excludable. So they're free to use, but when I use them, it stops other people from using that same good or decreases the quantity available to other people. Right? So the market, where supply is equal to demand, will be right here. With common resources, we said there exists negative externalities when people use them. So negative externality, marginal social cost is higher. So with, common resources, the market arrives at a quantity that is too high, but a price that is too low. So the market price will actually be less than the socially efficient price. And one way we said we could resolve this is taxing producers. Right? Now, once again, you could also tax consumers. It would decrease demand. You would still end up at the same quantity. It's just that if I model it through producers and think about taxing them, well, what is this price? This is going to be the new price that consumers pay. How much do sellers keep? Well, remember, with taxes and subsidies, there's a difference in between those prices. So the socially efficient price is actually going to refer to what the price in the market is, or what the price the consumer hands over to the seller is. The seller doesn't get to keep all of that. They only get to keep all of that minus the tax. Okay. So society's price will be greater than the market price, or I think the way this is phrased, the market price will be what? Less than the socially efficient price. Okay. Any questions on anything there before we keep moving? Okay. So like I said, I added some additional things in there, thinking about the quantity, price, thinking about taxes, but that should be a good look at that. So any other questions on these before we keep going here? So I looked at some of the feedback, and it was honestly almost evenly split between people wanting to see more problems worked through. So we have a little extra time today, so I will work through a couple of these practice problems from Module 7. Might help you for the quiz. I'm only going to choose a few here today, because I know there's a couple specifically that I could think about that I wanted to go over. So if I have a positive externality, right, I kind of made this point before, but we can compare not only the quantity, but also the socially optimal price. Okay. So when we had these positive externalities, and this is where I'll work through some things that are also not in that specific problem, but could be asked. So let's say I have my supply, my demand curve, marginal cost. So anytime I ask you about positive externalities, I'm assuming, right, or we're going to model these. I said you can model them through the supply curve, but for any question you're asked about the socially optimal price, we're modeling these additional benefits through the demand curve, or that society's benefits are higher. So it's this weird kind of outcome. We just talked about a negative externality, and we said there the socially efficient price is higher and the socially efficient quantity is lower. For a positive externality, the socially efficient quantity is higher. However, the socially efficient price will also be higher. So in both negative and positive externalities, that socially efficient price should be higher from both or in both cases. Where would my deadweight loss be? All right, we said when the market underproduces, we're missing out on, well, if there's no negative externalities, private marginal costs are the same as the society's marginal cost. So our deadweight loss is the difference between marginal social benefit and marginal social cost for all of these units that the market is not producing. So we've got this deadweight loss. How can we eliminate that deadweight loss? Well, the only tool we had with positive externalities was to make that demand curve equal that marginal social benefit curve by adding a subsidy to consumers. Or we could do subsidy to producers. It's just a little bit less clear that that's why, I think it's easier to think about subsidies to consumers here, and I'm never going to like specifically, we get the same result, so it doesn't really matter if I model it as through producers or consumers. In terms of the quantity, getting the quantity and price to match up, it'll be the same. Okay. Any questions on that one? Okay. I think this this chapter I think is a little bit easier. Let me think if there's anything up here that I wanted to specifically look at. So one thing that doesn't pop up in some of these problems, but that we did talk about with negative externalities. So when it comes to things like, do we tax or subsidize or set quotas? We also said that when we have negative externalities, we could use what? So if I had a negative externality and I was given government tools of, what would lower the quantity. One other thing that we had talked about is if I want the quantity to be here, it's currently up here, I could actually impose a price floor and prevent the price from getting down to that equilibrium price. Right? So whatever the equilibrium price is, I could use a price floor to limit the quantity. I could also use a price ceiling to limit that quantity. Okay. All right. And then another couple questions that I wanted to think about here. So when we're talking about positive and negative externalities, so here I want if the market operates without government intervention. If we have positive or negative externalities, we can talk about surpluses or shortages. So, and this is surpluses or shortages to society. So if I had, well, let's just match up that question. So that was a what? Oh, there it is. So I had a positive externality here. So if I have a positive externality, and I've got marginal social benefit being up here. If I have this market operating at its equilibrium point, okay, what's going to be true for society? So for society, at that price, here would be like society's quantity supplied. Here would be the total quantity demanded from society. So if I have a quantity demanded that is actually greater than my quantity supplied, there I would say that without government intervention, right? For society with these public goods, we're going to end up having kind of this shortage, right? Or this was the idea that when we have these positive externalities, we end up with too few of something, or not enough of a good for society. Okay. And then with common resources, we said there was too much, so that was where we would have kind of like a surplus for society. Okay. Generally, we're only talking about surpluses and shortages for the market, but we can also think about the surpluses and shortages for society. However, society, their quantity demanded with a positive externality wouldn't be from the demand curve. It's going to be from whatever that demand for society is, or that marginal social benefit curve. Okay. And then another example, kind of similar to what we talked about at the beginning, but I think it's a useful one. And I might give you some questions where I start to think about if I change characteristics of goods, what do they become? So typically, like in a regular semester, I've got 600 B251 students, and my office hours become very busy. So my crowded office hours, typically, if there's two people in my office, there's people waiting out in the hall. So there's someone using those office hours prevents other people from using them. So what does that make it? Rival. Now it's also free, so it's non-excludable, so that makes it a common resource. Okay. Excuse me. Now, so if it's a common resource, what can that fall victim to? Well, we would say the tragedy of the commons. So another example of the tragedy of the commons is when students come by during office hours or want to take my time, everyone has kind of the incentive to just ask as many questions as they want, and they don't think about the cost to other people. Well, everybody has that in mind, so they kind of overuse those office hours or create these huge negative externalities, or we have this tragedy of the commons. Right? So I have to be kind of good at regulating, setting quantity quotas in terms of you can't camp out here for an hour. Right? If instead I was thinking about something like, so during the regular school semester, there's actually these like help sessions where there's more seats than there are available, students available. So if you want to go to these, they're free, so they're non-excludable, and there's more than enough seats so that if any one student goes, it doesn't prevent any other student from also going to these help sessions. So if that's the case, right, it's non-rival, non-excludable. There, that would be a public good. Okay. So what happens with public goods? Well, generally they're over or we would say that there's positive externalities that exist to them. So they actually are under supply, the quantity in the market is too low, right, or underproduced. So unless I ensure that there's going to be a tutor there, generally I wouldn't have as many tutors show up as what would be socially efficient for my students. But I kind of have the command and control economy over that and can kind of dictate that they have to be there and show up to these sessions. All right. So I want to go through a few of those problems. I think got a couple extra minutes here. That should kind of do it for what I wanted to get through and cover today. So we finished up module 7 now. Module 8 we will start tomorrow. So I think module 8, it starts out, tomorrow's class won't be too bad. I will let you know that next week's material I think is considerably more difficult. So Monday's class period and then Tuesday and Wednesday will be, Monday's tougher in terms of the concepts that we'll cover. Tuesday and Wednesday are going to be more difficult in that we're going to be using a lot more math than what we have been. So with that in mind, come prepared next week. Those quizzes for 8 and module 9 will be due at the end of the day Thursday before our exam next Friday. So you'll have a little bit less time. I try to make the time in between exams as flexible as I can, but I don't want to have quiz due dates past when those quizzes are actually, showing up on an exam. So this week, everything's due at the end of the day Sunday. Next week, though, those quizzes from both modules will be due by the end of the day Thursday, so a pretty quick turnaround on Module 9. So I will try to go as quickly as possible through Module 8 and 9. I shouldn't say as quickly as possible. I still want to make sure it's, I go through it, with a level of detail. But I do want to make sure that, you can start looking at those materials early. You can start preparing for those quizzes. And hopefully give you plenty of time to prepare for those quizzes and next week's exam. So I'll end the recording there.